So I'm recording this, that way if you want to review what I said on a particular question, you can go and play the tape. Again, these are integrity files. So whether you look at this as an individual 50-point assignment, as it's listed in the syllabus, or as the take-home essay part of a 100-point test, is kind of immaterial. Either way, it amounts to the same thing. So remember, I'm looking for something that's typed, double-spaced, and 1.5 to 3 pages long. And again, usually the better essays are longer. Because people go into more detail and they do more of what they're supposed to do in writing good essays. So remember, some of the hints for writing an essay are also there in that handout that we went through in class. And these pages I've updated for the 11th edition. So you'll notice the first one says, explain, discuss, and evaluate the following passage from Plato's Myth of the Cave. Remember, I said for our purposes, myth, allegory, and parable can be used interchangeable, whether you call it the myth of the cave, the allegory, or the parable of the cave is irrelevant. We're going to take them as meaning the same thing. Now, this is from a different translation than the one in your book. For the prisoner's reality would consist of nothing but the shadows. Now, again, if you don't have the book, in supplementary readings, and I do this at least for the stuff you need for the first test, there is a translation of this part of Plato's Republic. So what you would want to do here is, remember, you want to suppose that your audience is not me. You're not writing an email to another professional philosopher where a lot of background is assumed. But, remember, part of the reason for doing this is to demonstrate that you've done your homework, that you've learned something about, say, the allegory of the cave. And so you're writing to an imaginary reader who is both intelligent but also ignorant of the particular topic. In other words, you're assuming that you need to bring somebody up to speed and that they're intelligent enough to understand what you're talking about. So you would want to bring in some background on Plato's story. Who's in the cave. Now we'll go through some of this in more detail when we go through the review sheet. But remember, the shadows, of course, are what the prisoners are only acquainted with. And why can they only see the shadows? What do we know about them that makes their situation very uncomfortable? Uh-huh.
They chained to the wall, and their neck is kind of fixed at the wall.
Yeah, really. In other words, as I said, we got to give Plato a grain of salt here, because some of us would say, well, even if I had my head and neck chained, I could still kind of look around in back of me, but we have to understand that the story wants us to say because the prisoner's head and necks are changed, they can only face the back wall. How long have they been in the cave? Yeah, pretty much most of their lives. And so the idea here is that they've grown up experiencing nothing but the shadows and for them, since they have seen nothing else to this point, the shadows have become reality itself. And those are the beliefs they form about the shadows. And what's casting the shadows? What's going on in back of them? Is this raised way? What's happening along the raised way in back of them? Remember,
It's a fire and people are moving statues and other objects behind them.
Behind the prisoners, in between the fire and where the prisoners are, people are carrying various things like statues of animals. But the prisoners can see only the shadows. And so even if they hear voices, they think the voices are coming from the shadows. So their belief is that reality is nothing but the shadows. Now, remember we said there are two interpretations of this allegory. Both are consistent with what Plato wanted it to do. One, he wanted the allegory to be a story of the critical function of philosophy, of how philosophy prompts us to examine our uncritically accepted beliefs, the ones that we have soaked up by osmosis from our own culture and have grown up like the prisoners in the cave, thinking they're good beliefs and they're true and they have to do with reality itself. And so this is what can get them to alter or question their beliefs. Well, what happens with one of the prisoners? Remember, he is loose from his chains by a person that represents a philosopher taking somebody on a philosophical journey out of the cave. Right? Now, I would remind you also, we're talking about particular interpretations. Remember, you have a handout in supplementary readings where I draw out the meanings of the allegory. And so even if you don't write on this question, you want to know what some of these things stand for, because those are the kinds of things that I would ask an objective question on. The prisoner's confronted with, he has his beliefs about reality and about what's true and what's real, questioned or challenged, because the first thing that he's shown are the objects that are carried in front of the fire that cast the shadows. And we see that he doesn't want to accept what he's being told, that the objects he's now being shown, in other words, this statue that Joe Blow is carrying across the pathway, is more real than the imperfect copy of it, the shadow that you've been familiar with. And at first he doesn't want to buy into this, that what he's now being shown is more real than what he had first known. But we see eventually he adjusts not only to the fire, but he's dragged up out into the outer world. And we get a long story of how his eyes adjust, and first he can only see reflections and things, then he can see stuff in the outer world lit up by the sun, and then finally he can view the sun itself. Now, don't try this at home, folks. Remember, this is only a story, right? We know that you can damage your eyes permanently by staring at the sun. But, so again, if we look at it as a story about the critical functional philosophy And this is what Socrates did with the people in Athens. He challenged them to examine the beliefs they had and the reasons they have for holding them. And on pages 10 through 13 of your book, your author illustrates how this might happen for somebody, with a story of somebody who comes to college with a particular religious point of view that they've grown up with, and how the college environment has them confront and challenge some of those beliefs. And so what I do is I give you the option of doing one or both of the possible interpretations. You can either talk about how this is a story of how philosophy challenges us to examine our beliefs and the reasons we have for them and correct them, maybe even jettison some of them. But, and so outside the cave are the beliefs that stand the critical examination of philosophy. So the third column in that handout you've got gives the other interpretation. Remember, we did a separate PowerPoint, and we're going to go over the theory of the forms in a little more detail. And for some reason, I thought we went over that. I usually put a little more than I've got on the theory of the forms. At any rate, so we'll, but basically, we see that everything inside the cave represents things in the world that our senses put us in touch with. Everything out of the cave represents the world of the forms, and then we saw how they contrast. At any rate, I'll say more about that, but you can discuss this using either interpretation. But again, both are down there, and we'll review these in more specifics. But right now, I just want to clue you in to some of what I'm looking for. Now, the more than one of these relate to that discussion in the Crito. What does Socrates imagine the laws of the city? Here, of course, we're talking about the city of Athens. Would say to him if they learn that he was planning to escape, or that he was at least considering his friend's offer. Well, remember, I said in order to understand why this would be such a rebellious action and challenge the very foundations of the state for Socrates, you have to understand that here he is, he's in prison, unjustly convicted as far as he's concerned, of some of these various charges, corrupting the youth of Athens, teaching them to be atheists, being mercenary, charging a fee for his services. But the point is, if you understand that, then you can see why Socrates thinks he can't just buy into his friend's offer of escape. And so we get a moral discussion in the Crito, weighing the reasons his friends give him for why he should escape. They say, among other things, Socrates, think about how public opinion is going to treat us, your friends, and how it might treat you. They say, aren't people going to say, well, some friends they were, they could have gotten him out. Many of those followers of Socrates were quite wealthy. They could have gotten him out of prison. Why didn't they? Some friends they were. And they also say, Socrates, shouldn't you be concerned about public opinion? Do you want people to think that you're not as manly as people think you are? Because Socrates was a real man's man. I mean, he was a real macho guy. You know, remember, he's an ex-soldier in the Peloponnesian War, big guy. Yeah.
As far as Socrates' idea said, like, it also goes back to him believing that you shouldn't listen to the public opinion. If you were a gladiator, you used to listen to the trainer, who already did it multiple times in a way that you know each way in which it will help you instead of listening to what everybody else sees. And everybody has not been in the same situation in which the trainer has been in. The trainer has already been through it himself and has to train other people to be successful in it.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right, and that is one of the counter arguments Socrates presents. Yeah, so Socrates and Plato are not very interested in our making our decisions about what to do by taking a public opinion poll or bringing in a focus group, the kinds of things our politicians would do today to figure out what positions they ought to hold. You're right. Socrates says, look, what would happen to an Olympic athlete if instead of listening to the specialist, to their trainer, they instead just listen to public opinion? You know, people would say, forget what your trainer says. Come on out with us and have some pizza or a cheeseburger, you know. And he ruins his training routine. So Socrates says, listen to an expert rather than the public opinion of people who don't know what they're talking about. And in this context, who is the expert when you're talking about having an ethical discussion? Yeah, Socrates himself. I mean, he never says that in so many words, but that's what's implied. Look, the person who's taken the place of the athletic trainer here is Socrates. And so he's saying, look, I'm going to weigh the arguments for and against this. I
always had like a general aspect of it. I always believe that Socrates was just a trainer, and all of his students as a whole was that athletic person that was trying to get better. And everybody was trying to put their 2 cents into trying to make them think, okay, well, maybe we should do this with that athletic trainer. Maybe we should just like not listen to him or do this. But Socrates telling them, no, listen, don't help me, don't do this. We want to go by the right way, regardless of what everybody says. And of course, the athletes listening to the public opinion. He said, if you listen to them, then you're going against what I say, which I am your teacher, I am your trainer. I'm helping you be better than you are already. So why would you go against me?
Yeah, well, right. And he's saying you could make some decisions. Just an athlete might make a wrong decision by not listening to their trainer, but public opinion and harming their, body. What Socrates and Plato believed is that we could fare worse in an afterlife if we didn't do the right thing now. And so for Socrates, there really is a fate worse than death. In fact, he confronts his prosecutors. He says, look, whatever you guys do to me, even in sentencing me to death, is not going to be anywhere near, in other words, any harm you do to me isn't going to be anywhere near the harm you do to yourselves by prosecuting and sentencing to death an innocent man. He says, you're going to harm your souls much more than you would any harm you do to me. So that's one reason why, for Socrates, this is an important decision for him, because he thinks if he makes the wrong decision, it could have repercussions even in the afterlife, that he's not going to fare as well if, say, he chooses to take his friends off for escape, and that turns out ethically not to be the right choice. So at any rate, one one way Socrates considers this is, what I was saying is, you have to remember at his trial, after the jury voted to convict him, since there was no specific penalty for what he was supposedly convicted of, the legal process provided that the prosecutors of somebody who was convicted would propose a penalty. We would call this the penalty phase of a trial. And then what they thought was fair was that the accused person or somebody representing them would propose a counter penalty, and then there would be a second jury vote.
And that's what he was like. He wanted to be like a smart ass. He was like, well, listen, I'm doing all this for free, so I think I should eat for free for the rest of my life, for every day, and that would be your punishment. Like that.
Yeah.
Smart.
Yeah, exactly. In other words, this is why he thinks this would be so rebellious for him to accept his friend's offer. Because at his trial, he could have proposed what his friends now propose. That is, he could have said, look, okay, I've been a bad boy. How about these prosecutors are threatening me with the death penalty. You know, it's kind of like the marshal who says in the old western town, either get out of town or meet me in the street at sundown, Socrates could have said, well, how about instead of you proposing to execute me, how about if I leave and never come back? Right? He could have proposed exile, and then if the jury had voted on it and chosen exile versus what the prosecutors wanted, then the legal system would have worked the way it was supposed to. Had that happened, Socrates would have gone into exile with the blessing of the state, because that would have been what the state's wishes were, whatever the jury voted for. But, right, as you said, Socrates becomes kind of a smart aleck. He's a very confrontational guy.
But not only that, but
he gives them
Socrates was a man of printed morals. Like him in his finest nature was a man that resented the idea of being anything less than what he was 100% capable of. He was not going to bend over just because he was this powerful figure. So in his mind, if he had said, "Oh well, I was wrong. I did this. Let me leave." That's two things that he probably didn't believe in, because now he's lying, which means that he's taking on a false personality of himself. He's going from the honest and characteristic and implicities that is him, and he's translating him into a lowly coward, which is degrading him in his own sense.
Yeah, and not only coward, but right, he says, and again, we didn't read through the Apology where Plato goes into detail, but he basically says, look, I think I'm being wrongly charged and convicted. And he says, even though you voted me guilty, I think I'm innocent and I don't deserve any penalty. And he mulls over in his mind things like a small fine. He says, I don't even deserve a small fine. Right, and then he gives the in-your-face reply.
And I feel it's because I always visit like Socrates as similar to like Monk, who says a man who lies or a man who breaks his word is half a man, and half a man isn't a man at all. So I always felt as though the Socrates is like, well, if I lie, that means that I'm either afraid of what they're going to do to me if I don't. Or if I leave, that means that I have to hold my head in shame for the rest of my life and live my life as if though I can't be me. And if you're not living your own existence, that means that you're not a man. And he makes this in several ways.
Right. He says, I don't think I deserve any penalty, and that's where he goes to the in-your-face reply. And he says, well, okay, you guys want me to propose a penalty? Here's one. In being a gadfly, in being like a horsefly, and challenging you and waking you up, he says, what I do and have been doing as such a public service to the city, you ought to be giving me a state pension. So if you want a penalty for the jury to vote on, how about a life pension, free meals forever in the Prytaneum, which is that was the lavish state dining hall where the big political bigwigs in Athens got to eat at the state's expense, but also where they honored the Olympic athletes. So he's essentially saying, I want the same kind of honor. So does that sound like much of a penalty? No, right? So the jury didn't have an option, so they voted for the only penalty that was actually on the table, which was the death penalty. So interpreters differ on this, but some people think they didn't really want to try to kill Socrates, but they thought if they scared him with the death penalty, he would propose something like exile, and they just kind of get rid of him because he was causing some trouble for the new government of Athens. Well, so at any rate, what we're getting at here is that now that the legal system has taken its course and given him the death penalty, he would be undermining the laws and the verdicts of the courts by accepting this offer to go let his friends bribe the guards, bail him out of jail, and spirit him away to Thessaly, Crito's hometown. And so he would be essentially going against the city. And you can see some of his arguments, and we'll go over these in more detail. If you look at some Crito arguments, I basically took some of that handout and put it in your review sheet. But Socrates looks at the this you didn't get this page.
That's not a problem. It's like number 3. Like, I don't even like that question. Because many
okay.
Yeah, like many people didn't even know that Martin Luther King, he wasn't this big old figure as much as people thought, that he would just like have like random people show up and walk. No, even in that time, he had to wait for a permit.
Okay, let me take things one at a time, because it's hard to follow. I'm trying to finish up what I'm doing on question 2, and then we can
we finished our first
talk. But what I'm saying is some of the arguments. See, Socrates says, look, I'm not going to listen to public opinion. That's not how I'm going to make my decision. He says I'm going to decide things the way I have all my life, and that's by weighing the arguments for and against. So he balances his friends' arguments about public opinion. They also say, well, what about your family, your young sons? Don't you want to be around to see them educated? Remember, Socrates, even though he's 70, has a wife that's more than 20 years younger and some kind of middle school age sons. So they give him various reasons why he should, and also that what would be a lot of money to the jailers is not much money to them since they come from wealthy families. So he's not going to be harming his friends financially. But at any rate, this thing on the laws of the city then come to Socrates and say, look, why are you trying to destroy us in the city? And they say, wouldn't a city itself be destroyed if its laws and the verdicts of its courts could be undermined by private individuals at will? You know, and so you get those arguments, and we'll look at them in more detail when we go over this. But I just want to call your attention to them. They're in that handout. So he actually looks at the city as if it were a person that could be harmed by his decisions. He also looks at the city as a parent. Says, and this to me is not a good argument, but he makes an analogy between a parent who punishes a child unjustly, they must say the child wasn't really guilty, and saying the child has no right to strike back at the parent because he's not on the same level, and saying no private citizen is on the same level as the state, so a private citizen who's being punished unjustly has no right to then strike back at the state, as Socrates thinks he would be doing by disrespecting and overturning the verdict of the court and accepting his friend's escape plan. Plus, you're talking about Socrates and his own what he advocates, and he says he thinks he would be hypocritical that he would be known as Socrates, the destroyer of laws, instead of teaching respect for what is moral. He would be a hypocrite himself if he left. So at any rate, those are some of the things you can bring in. Well, let's go to 3. Compare and contrast the views of Martin Luther King and Socrates. In other words, if you compare something, you're saying, well, how are they similar? To contrasting, you're saying, well, how are they different? Martin Luther King and Socrates on the issue of civil disobedience to law. Well, we just went over some of Socrates' attitudes, that even if we're punished unjustly by the state, we shouldn't directly strike out against them. So how are they like? How would they differ? That's a little redundant because compare and contrast. Sure. But anyway. So, okay, now let me know how you would take this, but we don't want to get too far off onto a tangent. You can go in your own essay into what you think.
Alright, so basically Martin Luther King and Socrates, they're similar in some ways, but as far as their actions, they are completely different. Martin Luther King was more of an indirect person. He wasn't the direct force to straight question people to their face. He'll do it in an undermining way. He'll have a big old speech and he'll talk to people. Unlike do you know who Marvin Garvey is?
No, but doesn't mean.
He is a man who was from Jamaica who came over to the United States, and he was more of the political man who went straight forward and did his actions directly.
Yeah.
Martin Luther King, he had a way of talking to people. Like Socrates, when he went to jail, and he waited there, and he did everything, and he waited the right way. That's something that Martin Luther King would have probably did also. But Martin Garvey would have went the other way. He would have been fighting for it, and he would have said, listen, it's just how Socrates did at the trial. I should not be punished for this. So instead of you punishing me, I see that you should punish yourself. And that's what Martin Luther King and Socrates did. Martin Luther King, he's going to take everything that you're going to give him. He's going to be like, all right, listen, I'm wrong for this, but I'm not wrong for being black. Socrates also believes that just because he's this type of person, just because he teaches this stuff, this is the way that he teaches it, and he's showing the flaws in this society, he should not be prosecuted because of that. But Martin Luther King was one that says I should not be prosecuted for being black. Not I shouldn't be prosecuted because I'm a speaker. Martin Luther King used to.
Okay. Some of this you ought to save for your own essay. Let me. Remember, we did a small group exercise where we looked at the part, and here again, if you haven't gotten your text yet, remember there's a copy of the whole letter from a Birmingham jail in supplementary readings. But remember, we focus, at least as a part in that letter that's most interesting from a philosopher's perspective, on the distinctions he makes between a just and an unjust law. And, so part of it, for Martin Luther King, an unjust law is no law at all. He quotes Augustine on this. We saw that. And so, his answer to his fellow clergy who said, well, how is it you can advocate obeying some laws and breaking others? Well, he says, okay, the reason I can do that is because I make a distinction between a just and an unjust law. And so we saw him go through the characteristics of a just versus an unjust law. I mean, what were some of the characteristics of one or the other? What is a just law? Well, remember it does things like affirms rather than degrades human personality. He says segregationist laws harm human personality on both sides. Gives the people who pass them a false sense of superiority, and those who have to live under them a false sense of inferiority. Remember, he also said that a just law is a law that if it's passed by a majority on a minority, it would obey the golden rule. That is, it's a law that those who pass it would be willing to live under themselves. And he says, well, is that true of a segregationist law? Would the people who pass these want to live under that law themselves? And, so he says it's an unjust law. And, so we went over a few other characteristics. So it seems like Martin Luther King would be more willing to, go against and overturn a law he thought was unjust than for Socrates say, well, even if it's unjust, the state's a parent, I'm a child, I got to obey the parent, But again, think about it, and you can weigh in on this. So remember, I'm going over these because even if you don't choose a particular one, the information is stuff that's going to be, stuff I'm asking objective questions about. Okay, well, again, I've more or less answered 4 already because it also speaks to that. Number 5 centers around. 5 and 6 both relate to Aristotle's virtue ethics. Remember, there's a list in your reading on that in your book at the end of around 531, 532 of the specific virtues and how he portrays them as a mean between extremes. And I've put in your review sheet the outline view of most of the Aristotle PowerPoint, right? And we're going to go over some of that. But again, 5 centers around the way he portrays particular virtues. 6 asks you to weigh in on his claims that learning a virtue, developing a virtuous character trait, first of all, is something that can be done, but needs to be done over time with practice, as developing a skill at playing a musical instrument or a skill like carpentry would be done, So 5 and 6 center on that kind of stuff. Okay, so Wednesday and or Friday we'll do more review, but I at least wanted to focus on this. Remember, this is due a week from today, 1.5 to 3 pages. I want you to turn them in as a printout, right? Don't email them to me. So you'll bring that next Monday, and then we'll do nothing but the Scantron part of it. But remember, there's a 10-point deduction for late essay, so you want to get it in on time. And thank you very much. We'll see you Wednesday. If anyone missed the handouts, just pick one up off the desk. Or if you missed the roll, somebody bring the roll up to me. Okay, let me hit this.